The Australian Financial Review.
For decades, Australia's richest person, Gina Rinehart, has carefully preserved the legacy of her father, Lang Hancock.
My father that made all this possible for us. His father chose to name this deposit and, in fact, a series of deposits after my mother.
So that I can carry on the work that my father has been doing.
She has made sure the country remembers Lang as an iron ore pioneer whose legendary flyovers led to the discovery of vast deposits and transformed the country's economy.
After a staggeringly costly 16-year legal battle, a judge ruling iron ore royalties must be shared.
But in a high-stakes court battle, Hancock Prospecting, the company he founded, which she now leads, was forced to tell a very different story.
Hancock Prospecting was laying bare all of these breaches of fiduciary duty that Lang committed over many, many years for the sole purpose of getting cash out of that business.
This story involves shady business dealings and a bitter power struggle.
Sources told us that Gina was really dragged kicking and screaming to this line of defence. She didn't want to go public in airing her father's sins.
The defence worked. A court ruling in April ensures Hancock Prospecting retains full control of the mines. But that victory comes at a cost, both financial and to Lang's reputation. Welcome to The Fin. I'm Lisa Murray. This week, reporters Jesinta, Burton and Tom Rabe on the landmark ruling, who won, who lost, and why this is just one part of the complex web of legal battles over Gina Rinehart's fortune. It's Thursday, April 30. Hi, Jesinta. Hi, Tom. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Hi, Lisa.
Hey, Lisa.
Jesinta, earlier this month, after a 2.5-year wait, finally the judgment landed in the case over the ownership and royalty rights to the sprawling Hope Downs iron ore mines in the Pilbara. The Hancock and Wright families have been fighting over this for decades. Both sides claimed victory in the wake of the judgment. What was this fight all about?
So the two main sides in this case were Rinehart's Hancock Prospecting and Wright Prospecting, which is led by the descendants of Peter Wright. Mm-hmm. It all comes down to a handshake agreement that these two men, who were previously school friends and then became business partners, signed decades ago. And they teamed up in the 1950s to conduct exploration activities and secure mining tenements, including over a site that later became known as Hope Downs. And during the 80s, they attempted to negotiate a series of agreements on how to divide those partnership assets. Mm-hmm. So the case began in 2010, and it centred on whether Wright Prospecting was entitled to a 1.25% royalty on the Hope Downs iron ore mines, which Hancock Prospecting now operates with Rio Tinto. And that's as part of a partnership deed that was signed by Hancock and Wright back in the 1980s. At the time, those two founders were well into their 70s, and they were trying to work out what the partnership might look like in the hands of the next generation. But they were at odds over how to divide the spoils of that partnership. Mm-hmm. So the mining tenements were seized by the state government shortly before Wright died, only to be clawed back and developed by Hancock Prospecting and Rio Tinto in the early 2000s. Hope Downs is now operated by Rio Tinto after opening in 2007 and paid Rinehart's company just under $1 billion last year. Mm-hmm. And in this court case, Wright Prospecting basically claims it was entitled to a stake and a share in future and past revenues. And the trial was held over about 51 days back in 2023. And Justice Jennifer Smith delivered her 1,655-page judgment earlier this month. Not a quick read, Lisa.
No. After a lengthy 16-year battle costing millions of dollars, it was Right Prospecting which claimed a partial win.
Basically, she found that Right Prospecting was entitled to a share of the revenue, so past and future.
Entitled to 50% of royalties from Hancock Prospecting's Hope Downs mines in the heart of the Pilbara.
But not to an ownership stake. And that was seen as a pretty big win for Gina Rinehart, Hancock Prospecting and Rio Tinto, because ultimately they still had security of ownership over these mines.
With Justice Smith finding Mrs. Rinehart's business as the rightful owner of the Hope Downs assets.
But it will cost them some money.
Right Prospecting is owed decades worth of the mine's royalties.
Yeah, so the Wright descendants, including the pretty reclusive Angela Bennett, her nieces Leonie Baldock and Alexandra Burt, they reckon they're owed more than $900 million in royalties from these mines. Hancock Prospecting says it's much less than that, roughly about $14 million a year, close to something like $300 million in total. But more importantly for Gina, this decision comes at the cost of Lang's reputation, because the judgment was pretty damning about his shifting around of assets, the secrecy of his business dealings and the like. So Smith found Hancock had exploited Hancock Prospecting's resources for his own personal gain, inking dodgy loans and routinely placing himself in positions of conflict, acting for both the vendor and purchaser in breach of conflict and profit rules. So Hancock Prospecting's barrister Noel Hutley told the WA Supreme Court that his client Gina took no joy in revisiting those events of the 1980s, but Dad's legacy effectively went under the bus to protect the family asset there. This is a court battle between the Wrights and Gina that has gone on for more than a decade, and sources told us that Gina was really dragged kicking and screaming to this line of defence. She didn't want to go public in airing her father's sins.
So in order to win, Gina Rinehart had to sacrifice essentially the legacy of her father. Jesinta, what was that legacy?
Well, it's a very well-told story here in Western Australia. Lang Hancock was an iron ore pioneer. He was a prospector in the Pilbara, and he was also an asbestos miner. In about November 1952...
I was flying down south with my wife.
According to a tale that's very much become legend in this state.
And we left a bit later than usual.
He was flying in a small aircraft over the Hamersley Range.
And by the time we got over the Hamersley Ranges...
there was a storm and he was forced to fly low.
Clouds had formed and the sieving got lower and lower.
And that is when he apparently saw these really significant deposits of iron ore.
And going through a gorge in the Turner River, I noticed that the walls looked to me to be solid iron. I'm particularly alerted by the rusty-looking colour on them.
And he laid down the foundation, really, of what would become his mining fortune, not through operating the mines necessarily, but through prospecting.
Iron to the left of you, iron to the right of you, iron straight ahead of you. It is iron, 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 wherever you look.
And through his partnership with Peter Wright.
Mr. Hancock has got the most driving imagination that I've ever met. He comes up with more imaginative ideas than any other person I've ever met.
He also ultimately signed royalty agreements with Rio Tinto that would make him a multi-millionaire. And he had one child.
And being an only child, everything will devolve upon her. So
Gina Rinehart, and they were really close.
As she gets older, she'll have a lot of responsibilities to undertake.
And he took her everywhere. He took her to all of his meetings. She was really closely involved in the business and she was determined to learn all about it.
I know that I've got an awful lot of work to do so that I can carry on the work that my father has been doing.
I guess she really saw herself as the heir apparent, the one to run that business with her father.
But it's just that I am the only child, so a lot of it does come my way.
But as was demonstrated by the evidence that later was tendered at trial, cracks began to emerge as she got a bit older.
Why did the relationship between Gina and her father break down? Essentially, what was the main problem with that relationship?
Effectively, they didn't really like each other's partners, Lisa. Gina married twice, first time briefly to an employee of the family firm. She had 2 children, John and Bianca. And then the second time, she married an American lawyer called Frank Rinehart, who was close to 40 years older than her, and they had another 2 children, Hope and Gina. After Gina's mother, Hope, died, she contested that will, and Lang, I think, always thought that Frank had something to do with that.
Mm-hmm.
Then Lang became involved with Rose Laxon,
I just found him to be a real man.
a young and outspoken and pretty colourful housekeeper that everyone predominantly knows as Rose Porteous,
I find him to be very sexy, that's all.
who was from the Philippines.
It makes me feel younger as part of it. No, it's a delightful experience for me.
She came on the scene within probably weeks of Lang's wife, Hope, dying. He was lonely and Rose was there.
And here I come with it very dark hair and obviously very youthful looking, and I say, a pleasure, my pleasure. I'm Mrs. Hancock.
There's actually a fantastic 60 Minutes episode that really showcases her personality.
Because I'm not shopping for $50 outfits, I want to make damn sure that I get the real good ones.
She's doing fashion parades for Lang. She's lying out by the pool.
Yvonne, if you're there, could you please bring me a bottle of Dom Perignon?
Demanding that staff bring her glasses of Dom Perignon for her and the reporter. And at the very end, the reporter actually remarks, "Oh, what have you got tucked into your pocket?" And she says,
I couldn't find the proper hanky that goes with it. So it's my knickers.
Gina really didn't like her, and the trial actually gave some pretty interesting insight into the level of disdain that existed between Gina and Rose. So there were telexes and letters from Gina to her father where she called Rose, and I'll quote here, a Oriental concubine, amongst other things.
Mm-hmm.
Around this time, Gina left for America with Frank.
2 years later, Lang had not only married Rose,
Lang actually made Rose a director in the company,
but thrown Gina off the family company board and installed Rose as a new director.
This was really kind of Lang's high roller era. They went on a round-the-world honeymoon on his Learjet. They built a mansion in Perth, and Gina basically felt like her inheritance was being squandered.
Mm-hmm.
And that is when it really hit home to Gina.
Where Georgina's left off, Rose has come in, and she's come in with a good deal of polish. And
that she might be cut out of this empire altogether.
Mm.
That's when things became really difficult between Gina and her father.
The 1990s were a really difficult period for Gina. Her husband Frank died in 1990, and then of course Lang died in early 1992. Gina and Rose were in the courts for more than a decade, fighting with each other over various assets. That battle ended ultimately with Rose keeping a few of those assets, including obviously the very famous Prix de Moore mansion,
Mm-hmm.
and Gina retaining sole control of Hancock Prospecting.
That legal battle played out in people's lounge rooms across the country. Everyone who grew up then remembers those characters. And Jesinta, you took me back to that time recently with the story you wrote.
Yeah, a portrait of Lang turned up with a bunch of other relics that were in a garage sale in Cottesloe that was being hosted by Rose's fourth husband, William Porteous. And they were various relics that had been in the mansion.
Did you go along to the garage sale?
I did. And the portrait was actually discovered while I was in there, which was really, really funny. A fellow customer actually remarked, "Oh, look, this is Lang."
Right.
Among a bunch of portraits of Rose Porteous too, might I add.
Yes.
But to get back to it, I mean, despite all of these legal battles, Gina still absolutely adored her father. And what this court case really revealed is that she had very quietly tried to reverse some of his dubious business dealings after his death, including a deal to give the grandchildren 49% of the family company so that she could ultimately keep control of the assets. And all of that really only became public once this court case went to trial.
And Tom, as Jesinta just mentioned, part of Lang's business dealings at the time had been to set up a trust and give his grandchildren a stake, and that's become a separate legal battleground. Gina and her two oldest children, John and Bianca, are now locked in private arbitration. How did that legal stoush come about?
That legal battle with John and Bianca has been running for 2 decades now.
Arguing their grandfather intended for the 4 grandchildren to have a stake in the mine's wealth.
Initially, it was fought pretty publicly.
When he moved Hope Downs and other Pilbara mining assets into a family trust before his death in 1992.
But now it's in a very private and secretive arbitration over allegations stemming from that alleged mishandling of the trust by Lang in the 80s.
Mm-hmm.
John, Lang's grandson, is the main driver here. He's had a pretty difficult relationship with his mother since probably the mid-2000s. And has since taken his grandfather's name.
Mm-hmm.
John joined the board of Hancock Prospecting when he was 21 and appeared to be basically the heir apparent until that falling out with his mother in the mid-2000s. Bianca and Hope, the 2 youngest girls, were attached to that legal dispute initially. But then Hope made a deal with her mum and swapped sides, and now Gina, the youngest, is probably closest with her mum.
Yeah, certainly. I think Gina is the person that we see most frequently pictured alongside her mother, and also at various company events. She does seem to be the person most closely tied to that business and the person most likely to succeed her.
John and Bianca claim the tenements were among those mining assets left in that trust. They were due to inherit when the youngest turned 25, but their mum, they say, unlawfully stripped the trusts of its assets in a series of pretty complex transactions that amounted to fraud, they claim, leaving it an empty shell. And so they say under that 1988 agreement, it was a 49-51 split between the trust and the company. But in correspondence between Gina and Lang, that proportion was reduced to 24%, and that percentage is what you'll see in the annual report each year on that last page as to the proportion of royalties being held in trust. Now, the kids argue that 24% isn't right, and the 1988 agreement entitles them to that full 49% of Hancock. The company maintains that Rinehart was following Lang's final wishes to restore the assets to the family empire, which he had unlawfully siphoned from the business for no consideration, and basically undo his wrongs there.
It was interesting. The extent of Lang Hancock's shifting of assets really only came to light in the months before he died. At that time, the company was in pretty significant financial stress, and he was attempting to do a deal with BHP for the sale of a tenement. And it was BHP who first raised concerns about various transfers and demanded that be resolved through the signing of a deed confirming ownership. So he essentially died, and the mess that had been created was very much left to Gina Rinehart to clean up. And that's when she embarked on the major clean-up effort that became really a key part of Hancock Prospecting's defence to the children's claims during the trial. Because the legal fight between Gina and John and Bianca is now in private arbitration, we really know very little about where the dispute is up to. But this court ruling has shed new light on aspects of that fight. And after 2 decades, there's even speculation now that family feud could finally be resolved.
We're talking about the complex web of legal cases involving Australia's richest person, Gina Rinehart. A recent court ruling has ensured Rinehart retains control of lucrative mining assets in the Pilbara, but she'll be forced to pay substantial royalties. Tom, what did the court ruling reveal about Gina's other legal battle with her children?
Yeah, it was actually pretty revealing, Lisa. The judge basically ruled that Hancock Prospecting is the rightful owner of Hope Downs, and after it came out, the company put out a statement kind of beating its chest and saying that the ruling rejected these what they called baseless ownership claims by the Wrights, but also John and Bianca.
Mm-hmm.
Despite that, John especially sees things kind of differently. He put out his own statement on the day. It was kind of one of those days where everyone is claiming they're a winner.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, first of all, he wanted to make clear that it wasn't their decision to be part of this case. He said that he and his sister were joined by those opponents, Wright and Rhodes, in 2016 regarding that equity claim to Hope Downs, and they didn't choose or kind of need to be involved as a party. But more importantly, he said they weren't claiming anything in this litigation, so he didn't expect any award, and their claims were referred to private arbitration, or most of them were.
Mm-hmm.
But then he went on to explain that some of the evidence and information revealed during this recent trial line up with what he's claimed for decades, and
Mm-hmm.
saying these findings and remarks centre upon that agreement between Lang Hancock and Gina Rinehart for Hancock Prospecting to be split 51-49 between Gina and her children upon Lang's passing, and for Gina to be the trustee of those interests until the youngest child reached 25.
Mm-hmm.
So he clearly thinks there is the potential for an outcome here or a deal now that this is out in the public domain, and that the Wrights and Rhodes cases have paved the way for this. He goes on to talk a bit about how he supported Gina through the 90s and 2000s, and that he wants to finally put the events from the last few decades behind them. But if no deal is struck in arbitration, Gina's got endless money to throw at this for a very long time.
Mm. So, Jesinta, if we're talking about winners and losers from this court ruling, Gina Rinehart and Rio Tinto are ultimately the winners because they retain control of Hope Downs, but they lose out in terms of royalties, and the Wrights win on that front. They have a new revenue stream but no stake. And Gina's two children, John and Bianca, have also been dealt a blow in their legal case, although they claim differently, as Tom's just explained. But there's also another less well-known and unexpected winner. Who is Don Rhodes?
Yeah, there is, Lisa. Rhodes is unfortunately an often forgotten figure in the Pilbara. And I guess in many ways, this court ruling has kind of finally given him and the family company some recognition.
Mm-hmm.
He had a very varied career. I mean, he began on the family farm. He also began working as a sort of truck driver between Perth and Darwin. He then owned an earth-moving company, and ultimately he was exploring the Pilbara. He met Lang through a relative, and it was actually Lang who referred to him as the father of the manganese industry. He was the person that Lang sent as his associate to help inspect and progress work at Hope Downs, because, you know, Lang and Peter at the time, they couldn't get the tenements. They already had too many for themselves. And so at that time, Rhodes was working with a couple of brothers known now as the Nicholas brothers.
Mm-hmm.
He really was a crucial figure, but an often forgotten pioneer in that industry. So 3 years after the Wrights began their legal action, Rhodes launched a legal action of its own and was ultimately joined to this action because they also were claiming a share of past and future royalties on various Hope Downs tenements.
And looking for a 1.25% share, the family of the late Don Rhodes, a Pilbara trucker and prospector.
And he was certainly a winner in this judgment. His claim for a share of past and future royalties was upheld.
We are very, very pleased.
And his role in Hope Downs.
The judgment has recognised the contribution of Don Rhodes to the iron ore industry.
Was ultimately recognised.
And how will the size of those royalties owed to the Wrights and Rhodes be determined?
So there was a hearing held last week to determine sort of, I guess, next steps for calculating the quantum of the monies owed, which has ultimately emerged as a sticking point between the parties. That amount is expected to run into the hundreds of millions of dollars.
Mm-hmm.
Justice Smith actually suggested that, you know, the Wrights had won some, they'd lost some, Hancock won some, they lost some. Perhaps the parties should all just pay their own legal fees. And I guess really that's just the start of the legal wrangling. Justice Smith deferred any sort of disputes stemming from the calculations, including the determination of interest on those payments, to another judge who will become ultimately the fourth to preside over this dispute since it began back in 2010. This week she will hand down some sort of an order for next steps, and then it will be about legal costs.
So a final question then. Is this court ruling the beginning of the end for Gina Rinehart's legal woes? How will Australia's richest person emerge from this?
Yeah, Lisa, you have to kind of wonder what constitutes a win now for all involved, given the millions of dollars in legal fees and decades spent in court. Gina's, 72 now. She can probably just keep elements of this litigation or the defence to it rolling for the rest of her life. John, despite saying he wants to make up and holding out that olive branch a couple of weeks ago, he's also, signalling he is intent on trying to claim his stake of the family empire. But it's also just a bit of a sad family picture here. I was reading up ahead of the judgment the other day and found this old Sydney Morning Herald article that had this photo from the 1970s of Lang and his wife Hope and Gina there with John, who's a baby in Lang's arms. And you kind of forget amongst all of the fights here that this was effectively just two schoolmates that stumbled upon what would become Australia's biggest industries. And the price they've paid for that is their descendants just going to war for decades. And it is a bit of a sad story, really.
Although this has very much been framed as a win for Gina Rinehart and Hancock prospecting, it's come at a cost. And as Tom pointed out, really to Mrs. Rinehart, there's nothing more precious than Lang's reputation. I mean, Hancock prospecting was laying bare all of these breaches of fiduciary duty that Lang committed over many, many years for the sole purpose of getting cash out of that business. And meanwhile, during these submissions, Gina is at the Australians Bush Summit talking about just how wonderful he was and how much she admired him, and sharing stories and talking about his legacy and how much he'd done for the state and for the country. And despite marking a pretty critical juncture in this legal dispute between really the state's most notable mining families, this judgment is widely expected to be appealed. And in the hearing just gone on Friday, those views were very much reaffirmed. It was pretty clear that there was a lot more life in this dispute.
Thanks, Jesinta. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lisa.
On the podcast today, reporters Jesinta Burton and Tom Rabe. The Fin is produced by Mandy Coolin. Head of audio is Alex Gow, who also composed our theme. And Fiona Buffini is head of premium content. If you enjoyed this episode, send it to a friend, as it helps others find us. And follow us wherever you get your podcasts. For more stories about markets, business and power, subscribe to The Financial Review at afr.com/subscribe. I'm Lisa Murray. See you next week.
The Australian Financial Review.